Earlier this spring at the Esri Developer Summit in Palm Springs, Esri announced the retirement of two of its popular products in building web applications, the ArcGIS API for JavaScript version 3.x and the ArcGIS Web AppBuilder.
We recognize this is big news as many of you built your web apps using these technologies. So to help us understand how this will impact you and what you can do moving forward, we're joined by Maura Daffron. She is our Geo Developer Advocate for Esri Canada and is joining us today from Toronto. Hello, Maura.
Hey guys, how you doing today?
Doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
All right, so let's start on the ArcGIS API side first. So we know that this announcement came from Esri, is very formal. What can you tell us about the timeline of when this is going to happen and what's going to happen when that date occurs, when it's retired?
So just with respect to the ArcGIS API for JavaScript 3.x, that'll be retired on July 1st, 2024. So when the API is retired, the nice thing about it is because the API will continue to be hosted on our content delivery network, all your apps that you develop should continue to work as expected. But the thing to keep in mind is that once it's retired, there will be no further bug fixes or enhancements to the APIs. So in addition, technical support will no longer be available. So to ensure that your 3x apps run as expected, until you're able to migrate, you should be mindful about any browser updates that could introduce new issues that won't be fixed in API patches.
Okay, so you mentioned that some apps will continue to work, or apps built on it will continue after retirement, which is great. Are there any apps that we should be aware of that are affected by this? Like which apps would those be?
Yeah, any applications that were built using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript 3.x will be affected. So this includes the Map Viewer Classic, which I know a lot of people happen to be using, and any of the ArcGIS configurable apps. Again, these apps should continue to function after the retirement date, but as I mentioned previously, you should be quite mindful of any browser updates that may break these apps themselves. In addition, any apps that were built using the ArcGIS Web AppBuilder will be affected by this change as well.
Right, and we'll talk a little bit about the web app builder coming up in a sec, but what about those hardcore developers who actually delve into the API and build their own custom apps? So what's going to happen to their applications when the API retires?
So again, any custom apps should continue to function as expected because the ArcGIS API 3x API is still hosted on our content delivery network. But again, it's considered to be best practice to migrate these apps to the 4x SDK. And again, as there is no direct migration, any code that you've written will have to be rewritten using the ArcGIS Maps SDK 4.x.
Okay, so lots of people have to be aware of some changes, which is important to know. So thanks for being here to remind them of that. And then specifically, let's take a look at talk about the web app builder. I know a lot of people love that application and have been using it for a long time. What is the timeline looking like for its retirement?
So the Web App Builder Developer Edition will be retired in time with the ArcGIS API JavaScript 3.x. So it will retire in July 2024 in alignment with the 3.x API. The Web App Builder that is included as part of ArcGIS Online will retire in the fourth quarter of 2025. And of course, there's the Web App Builder that is part of ArcGIS Enterprise. And that will continue to be part of Enterprise until the first half of 2025, at which point it will be retired and no longer released to new versions of Enterprise. Existing versions of Enterprise will continue to support the ArcGIS Web App Builder in accordance with the ArcGIS Enterprise product lifecycle.
Yes, that's really important to note, right? So if you've got the developer edition, it's going to be 24, but for a lot of people like myself who use the web app builder from ArcGIS Online, you got till the end of 25, correct?
Right, that's correct. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Now, I know there are a lot of those users like myself who loved Web App Builder, loved how it works. What are some of the strategies, I guess, if you're thinking about migrating away from your current Web App Builder app and maybe choosing something a little bit more modern that takes advantage of that ArcGIS Maps SDK 4x for JavaScript?
Right. So I'd say the best strategy is to take some time to analyze your applications. So take a real good look at what your applications do, Document the requirements and use cases so you have a good understanding of what your application does and who uses it. And then look at the options that are available for you when moving to the newer technologies. Chances are you might not even have to do any coding to migrate. You can look at using ArcGIS Instant Apps to migrate, ArcGIS Story Maps, or ArcGIS Experience Builder to see if you can implement custom applications without doing any coding. If you do need to implement custom functionality, consider creating a new application using the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript 4.x or building custom widgets for Experience Builder. Now, I should note when it comes to creating custom widgets, it's recommended that your developers have knowledge of two technologies that Experience Builder uses, TypeScript and React. So that might be something that your developers might have to work on learning to work with Experience Builder effectively.
Okay, so it looks like there's a lot of options out there for people, which is great, and might require a little bit of learning on some ends just to see what different options there are. Were there any resources available about the migration that can help people with this transition?
Oh, there's tons. So I'd say the best resource is the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript documentation on developers.arcgis.com. This is your main site that you would go to for any help or reference or information about the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript. In addition to the documentation for the Maps SDK for JavaScript, it includes a guide for migration to the 3x from the 3x API to the current version of the Maps SDK for JavaScript, which discusses the differences between the two APIs and any concepts that developers will need to understand when working with the Maps SDK for JavaScript. The SDK documentation also includes fundamentals and core concepts for the Maps SDK for JavaScript that are useful when learning the new technology. In addition, this site includes live samples that you can work with in CodePen to gain an understanding of the technology. Finally, Esri has created some videos on MediaSpace that provide an introduction to the Maps SDK to JavaScript. In addition, Esri has also written some blog posts that discuss the retirement of the JavaScript API 3.x that are well worth reading. And finally, the Esri community is a question and answer board that is useful for when you run into problems developing with the SDK and need to get input from other users.
Oh man, that is such a relief. I need all the help I can get when it comes
Right.
to this stuff. So
Yeah, there's tons of resources out there. I mean, one other thing that I should mention is, of course, Esri Canada has technical support, and we have a robust Esri Canada developer support team, which can also help you with any issues that you have working with the 4X SDK.
yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion out there as the date approaches. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more feedback and a lot more ways that we can communicate and help you guys out as we go through this transitional period. In fact, I think I'm doing a webinar in September on this topic for the Web App Builder. So I'm looking forward.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I know it's gonna be a lot of fun. All right, so just as we begin to wrap up here, I'm sure you get a lot of questions about this, and I'm sure there's a lot of reaction that you have encountered so far about this news. So what are sort of the three takeaways, sort of things to reassure our developer community as this transition moves forward?
Well, I'd say the first thing is that change is coming, so it's best to be prepared. So you have a year before the ArcGIS API for JavaScript will be retired. So it's best to spend that time preparing for the migration. Look at the apps that you've built or that leverage the ArcGIS API for JavaScript 3x and determine what the best path forward is, either using the code-free approach using Instant Apps and Experience Builder, or building your own custom apps using the ArcGIS SDK for JavaScript. Second, any apps that you built using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript or Web App Builder will continue to work after the API is retired, as the API will continue to be hosted on our content delivery network. That being said, again, any browser updates that break these apps will not be addressed by Esri, as this API will no longer be supported by technical support. So even though these apps should continue to function, it's best practice to move over onto the newer technology. Finally, you may need to learn new technologies such as TypeScript and React to leverage the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript, especially if you're looking at building custom widgets for Experience Builder. So it's best to get your developers trained up on these new technologies as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's all really good advice, and probably the most important thing is don't panic.
Yeah, don't panic. I mean, everything should continue to work as expected. I mean, just be quite mindful about any browser updates that you happen to roll out after the retirement date, just so that your apps will continue to work as they are expected to do so.
Wow, Maura, that was a lot of really good information, and I'm sure our web developer community really appreciates your feedback. So thanks so much for joining us today on the
You're
Spatial
welcome.
podcast.